So the next presentation is given by Pete Smith. Will be about potential impacts of land-based negative emissions technologies on biodiversity and ecosystem services. But before that,
okay. Enable content. There's another one on the other screen. I don't know if you can get the mouse onto that. No, I can't. Yeah. Cool. Thank you. So I'm going to talk today about land-based negative emission technologies and the impacts on biodiversity and ecosystem services. So a lot of this work came about from a project which was put together, well, the Global Carbon Project put together a meeting, I think it was in 2014, to look at negative emissions. And at that point, I didn't know what negative emissions were. It was a new phrase for me. I'd been working on carbon sequestration for about 20 years, but I didn't realize that that was a negative emission technology. So I was very pleased to find that it was relevant. So this is the group of people who were there. You'll see a number of people who are at this meeting, not all as attractive as me, obviously. But what happened there, I happened to be sitting in the wrong place in one of the breakout groups, which meant that I was lumbered with writing up this paper, putting together this analysis. There are over 40 co-authors, all busy people. It's like herding cats. But after a couple of years, we eventually got this together for a little review, which appeared in Nature Climate Change, to assess some of the biophysical and economic limits. So I'm not going to talk about the economic limits so much today, or the energy limits. I'm going to focus mainly on the environmental impacts and how they relate to ecosystem services. We covered a range of technologies in this one, but sorry, a couple of years. A year after that one, I wrote another little paper which just added the same sort of analysis for soils and biochar. I'm going to talk a lot more about soils. I've got another talk tomorrow morning, so I'll save some of that. But just for completeness, I put this in so that we can compare across the different technologies. So the negative emissions technologies that I'll talk about are enhanced weathering of minerals, afforestation, reforestation, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, soil carbon sequestration, and biochar. Also included in the analysis was direct air capture, but since that's not land-based, I won't be focusing on that today. So the negative emissions technologies work like this. We've got, under the business as usual, we're burning fossil fuels and we're taking them out of the ground and we're putting that carbon dioxide up into the atmosphere where it's causing a problem. With bioenergy, we just recycle this, so we take the carbon from the atmosphere into the land. When we burn it, we get biogenic emissions, which go back up into the atmosphere. It's not totally carbon neutral because there are other costs associated with that, but these are the main flows. That's not a negative emission technology. Carbon capture and storage is not a negative emission technology. It's where we burn the fossil fuels, we capture the carbon, and we put it back down. So we're just preventing that from getting into the atmosphere. It's not negative emissions. Everything after C, so D down to K, are all negative emissions technologies in that they remove carbon from the atmosphere and put them either into geological storage, as with BECCS, into geological storage through reaction with minerals, with enhanced weathering, and the other ones put either into the land or to the ocean sinks. So these are not into geological storage, but into medium-term pools of carbon storage. So negative emissions technologies, and of those, all of these ones are land-based. So those are the ones that I'm going to talk a little bit more about today. So when you do the first analysis, looking at the impact on other environmental externalities or ecosystem services, you can look at things like the land footprint, the water footprint, the impact on nutrients, albedo, some of those sorts of things. So we attempted to do that by looking at a constant unit. So we harmonised all of the information that we could find in the literature, and it's fairly scarce in some places, to try and get the best estimates of the area required per tonne of carbon removed from the atmosphere. So all of these results that are shown on this page are normalised per tonne of carbon removed. So we see here that crop-based BECCS and forest-based BECCS have a large land footprint, as you would expect, compared to direct air capture and enhanced weathering. Similarly, the crop-based BECCS, the forest-based BECCS and afforestation, reforestation have a large water footprint. They require water. So already we're seeing impacts on the land, and we'll come back to the impacts on biodiversity via the land footprint. But we're seeing impacts on water quantity, the water that's available as part of our freshwater extraction. We're seeing impacts on nutrients as well, because you have to keep a stoichiometric ratio between C and N and B in the biomass as it grows. Then if we want to grow more carbon, we also have to add more nitrogen and more phosphorus, for example. We have an impact on albedo. So this is the afforestation in the north, where if you get over a certain latitude, the impact on albedo, particularly where you have snow cover, is larger than the carbon that you offset. So there are good places and bad places to do afforestation, and this has been known for some time. Energy I won't talk about, and cost I won't talk about, because I'm focusing on the ecosystem services rather than the other limits. So what this enabled us to do, it enabled us to put together, this is what Nature Climate Change and the IPCC call an iconic figure. To everybody else, it's a totally incomprehensible figure. So what I'll do is I'll talk you through it. What we've got here is energy. If it's over this side of the graph, energy is required. So these technologies use energy. If it's to the left of the center line, it produces energy. So we've got things like BECCS over here, and biochar is exothermic. It can produce energy. What's shown on this axis is the negative emission potential. Again, this is expressed in gigatons of carbon, not CO2. And it's normalized to this BECCS. So this was the average that comes out of the integrated assessment models from the scenario database from the last IPCC assessment report. The bigger the blob, the bigger the cost. So these are the more expensive options. So DAC and EW are more expensive than afforestation. BECCS, biochar, soil carbon sequestration. The land footprint is shown in the color. So if it's green, it has a small land footprint. And as you get to the warmer colors through to purple, then you have a larger land footprint. So these blobs up here have a large land footprint. The only intuitive thing on the whole graph is the water blob. So the water droplet indicates the water footprint. So when it's a very full blob, it has a full drip of water, has a very large water footprint, and an empty one has a very low water footprint. So by putting this information together, we can start to see that there are some options. Well, the first thing to emerge is there's no magic bullet. There's no one negative emission technology when you consider all these environmental externalities, which jumps out as the one which we really must use. You've either got a lot of potential but a large land footprint or water footprint, or you've got a smaller potential with a smaller land and water footprint, or you're getting into high energy costs or high economic costs. So given that there's no immediate magic bullet, we probably need to consider a portfolio, and that's something that's come up again and again over the last couple of days. So I can't remember why that one's there. Let's move on to the next one. We can also start looking at the biodiversity impact. So this was a study that we put together with colleagues in Finland, and what we did was they're biodiversity experts. We sort of generate information on the biophysical changes in the land surface. We generated for the different energy, so for renewable energies, wind, solar, and bioenergy, the land footprint, and we simply overlaid this with some of the areas that are protected for biodiversity conservation. So the red areas are good for producing bioenergy. This is where we have the largest bioenergy potential that we might use for BECCS. But you can see that there are some areas where there's a significant conflict or a significant overlap between the areas that are really good for doing bioenergy, but the areas that we need to conserve for biodiversity. So this is really only a sort of a first attempt. What we need to do is understand this better. We need to understand the context. Could we be doing bioenergy here, but just not here? Could we be using some of the bioenergy in other areas which have less biodiversity impact? So we need to zoom in. We need to have better mechanistic models, and we're now getting the databases put together. Databases such as the Predicts database, which lists a whole bunch of different measures of biodiversity and impacts of biodiversity down to the individual taxa. And we've just started using that to look at some of those impacts. Now, the reason negative emissions sometimes have a bad name is because of that large land footprint, large water footprint. So at the end of 2017, Bronson Griscom and a whole bunch of colleagues, another great big long author list, had a paper out in PNAS, which looked at what are the alternatives to some of those more tricky negative emission technologies, particularly BECCS. And they did this analysis looking at what was called natural carbon sequestration or natural climate solutions. So this starts to map out the space in which we could do wetland restoration, we could do afforestation, reforestation, and we can do activities within the agricultural sector which don't necessarily compete with the land that we're using for food and for biodiversity conservation. In fact, a number of these measures would be proposed for biodiversity conservation, and it just happens that they have a negative emission potential. So this has caught the attention of many policymakers, not just in Europe but around the world, because it offers them a more simple solution where you're not going to have so much of the pushback. But I have a caveat, which I will come back to a little bit later. These natural climate solutions don't get us to where we need to be to hit the 1.5 or the 2 degree target. Another way of looking at the biodiversity impacts is looking, the impacts on ecosystem services, is to look first at, so I'm a soil scientist, this is looking at the impacts of soils. So if we're managing soils for soil carbon sequestration, for negative emissions, we've got a bunch of soil functions that are related to that. Those soil functions underpin a whole bunch of ecosystem services, and those ecosystem services and functions underpin a number of the Sustainable Development Goals. So when we started putting this paper together, the impacts of sort of soil carbon sequestration on the Sustainable Development Goals, we were just scattering around all over the place. It will be good for this, it will be bad for that. And putting it together into this conceptual framework, which Cecilia Keistra came up with in Wageningen, was to formalise this soil function ecosystem service SDG way of looking at it. And I thought it was quite neat because we can look then at, for example, if we're looking at this ecosystem service here, ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. You can see the ecosystem services that are affected. You can see the ecosystem services in green, the soil functions which underpin those ecosystem services in red, and you can relate them back to the individual action. And you could do this for all of the negative emission technologies. Hasn't been done yet, but it could be done. The other informative and interesting piece of work was Vera Heck's paper from Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research. And this one was looking at BECCS. And one of the, this was again looking at some ecosystem services like freshwater use, land system change, biogeochemical flows, and with relevance to the biodiversity is the biosphere integrity. So this is looking at the percentage loss, and the further you are out on here, then the worse you're impacting upon biodiversity. You can optimize the model in a number of ways. So just here's a couple of examples. So this is looking at the impact where there's a prioritization for biodiversity conservation. What happens if we try to conserve biodiversity at the expense of some of the ecosystem services? And what you can see here is as you ramp up the ambition, you start to push more into the biogeochemical flows. So the nitrogen balance is getting much worse, even though we're minimizing the impact on biodiversity. You can try and optimize it in other ways. So you can look at freshwater conservation. So if you try to minimize the impact on fresh water, you have impacts on nitrogen, and you have adverse impacts, greater impacts on biosphere integrity. So this was a really nice analysis because it gives us sort of a framework to look at a bunch of related ecosystem services in a more systematic way than we were able to do in the Nature Climate Change paper. And we're also able to then assess risk. So this paper shows the areas where there's a risk where the uncertainty is very, very high. These are the high-risk areas in red. The green, so much of Europe is in the green. Scandinavia just starting to get into that zone in the middle where it's a bit more difficult. But there are some areas of low risk for BECCS to be used without many adverse impacts. But there are also some areas where it could have some significant impacts, either on, this is freshwater conservation, or here on biodiversity. So this is a way of optimizing, using models to optimize and to calculate our risk of different interventions in the future. And I'll just finish up with an example from a paper that we published only a few weeks ago, looking at the impacts on terrestrial biodiversity of moving from a 2 degrees target to a 1.5 degree target. Nobody likes this paper. Nevertheless, it's published, so there. And what we did as part of that is we looked at the impact on biodiversity, the direct impacts of moving from a 2 degree world to a 1.5 degree world. In the second section, we looked at the impact of the mitigation measures that might be required to get us there. So the impact of the mitigation measures, what do they do to biodiversity? And in the third part of the paper, we looked at the greenhouse gas removal or negative emissions technologies to try and assess what impact they would have semi-quantitatively. We came up, I'm just extracting one of the tables from this. This is just looking at the impact on biodiversity at the local catchment scale and regional. So direct air capture has no impact, it's not land-based. Enhanced mineral weathering, there could be positive or could be negative impacts, probably zero impact at the regional scale. Soil carbon sequestration, there could be biodiversity benefits or no impact. For biochar, there seems to be reasonable evidence that there would be a positive impact on biodiversity across a range of scales. BECCS probably has a negative impact across a range of scales, but again, there are appropriate places to do BECCS where you may be able to minimize these impacts. But there are 99 ways to do something wrong and one way to do it right. So with these technologies, it's just showing that there's a risk where we need to work harder at minimizing those adverse side effects on biodiversity. And then we've got afforestation, reforestation being very, very context specific. So there's more written about this table to expand upon those and explain those a little bit. But I think this is an area that needs more work, and I think that we could do better in the future with the sorts of models that are being used in Potsdam, some that are being developed in EASA, and I think the image model has the capacity to do some of this as well. So here's another thing that nobody liked, which was the little summary that we were going to include in the UNEP gap report, the emissions gap report. This was pulled at the last minute, but I liked it, so I'm showing it anyway. Which is looking at the sort of the land impact, the water impact, the greenhouse gas impact, so that we can start looking at some of those ecosystem services and characterizing them in terms of go ahead or there may be risks. Coming back to the point that I made earlier, so this natural climate solutions thing caught the attention of policymakers because policymakers were thinking this is something that we'll have broad support for. Everybody will be behind this. It's got many co-benefits. The problem is it doesn't quite get us to where we need to be. So this paper was published by Michael Obersteiner earlier this year with colleagues. And this looks at what happens if we leave BECCS or we leave CDR until the second half of the century. And because of the overshoot in the temperature, we start to get some really, really bad impacts. The natural land lost is really, 26%, or by 2025, it's 33%. There are these other issues on backstop reliance, but I won't go into that one. If we just look at natural land lost, because we're talking about ecosystem services and biodiversity, it suggests that if we want to protect these and to minimize these impacts, we have to go for a zero overshoot scenario. And a zero overshoot scenario, we can't get there with just natural climate solutions. We need to do some early BECCS and some other large-scale CDRs. So we're not in a position where we can say, let's just do the easy stuff now and leave the difficult stuff till later. We probably, I think, have to start acting with some of these uglier measures. So BECS, not many people like it. Even the people who like it don't like it very much. But we may need it. So we need to find ways of doing it in an appropriate way, which minimises the impacts. So in conclusion, we can do these, we can do the technologies that we can remove carbon from the atmosphere. There are varying impacts on biodiversity, which are largely linked to the land footprint and the water footprint. We need to improve governance to ensure sustainable implementation. So because we need to move quickly on many of these technologies, we need to improve the governance structures to allow that to happen. We need more R&D for some of them, but for some of them we're ready to go. But we need pilot projects and demonstration projects to scale these things up, because we only really learn by doing and learning what the costs are. And finally, this is just there's been a lot said today already about the sort of moral hazard. There is this moral hazard issue. So really, I don't like to put anything up about nets without saying that we really do need to have aggressive and immediate mitigation action. We can't do this in place. It's probably not possible to meet the Paris target without some form of nets, and Detlef's paper published just a few weeks ago shows that very, very nicely. And we might need nets sooner rather than later if we want to avoid that overshoot. And that might mean that we need to consider some of the more challenging nets, such as BECS, but we need to do that in a way which minimises the impacts on ecosystem services and biodiversity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time.